about a round of applause for these guys for the morning? Was that spectacular or what? I want to point out one distinguishing characteristic about Chris, and you probably discerned it from just his words of affirmation and his comments today, but Chris and his firm have always been available and there and ready whenever the College of Architecture or Texas A&M University has asked them to rise to the occasion. They have, as our dean stated so eloquently earlier, they've always answered the call. And what you're going to soon hear firsthand are some testimonials from 7 program alums who exactly how Chris personally and the principals in his firm have helped them to grow and to reach their full potential, and if nothing else, to sort of ignite a spark in their careers that that really has set them in a cool track, and you'll hear that. Chad Long, whose class of 16, Chad, where are you? Are you here somewhere? Has flown in from Chicago to join fellow Aggies, and they've come from Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, New Braunfels, San Antonio, Austin, everywhere, and I think that speaks volumes about their affection and appreciation for Chris and his team and what it's meant to their careers. So I'm going to turn the program now over to Max Harford, who's going to facilitate the fellow Aggies as they tell their stories.
You got it.
So, yep, as we just talked about, we're 7 alum. We've worked closely with Chris over many years now. And the way that we'll kind of approach this is Quincy will start us off, and he was really the pioneer, I guess, for us to have this experience, but he'll kind of talk about how this has shaped his career and how it really jump-started his career, and we'll just kind of move in chronological order, and you'll see kind of the projects we've touched and how those projects have shaped what we do now here in the States. So with that, Quincy, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Are we going to speak from that podium, or are we going to sit down?
You're fine there.
I'm fine. Where's Max going to sit?
I'm fine here.
You're going to stand up?
I'm fine here.
Oh, great. Howdy. Thanks again for your time coming here. I know academic obligations and commitments consider your time precious. My hope is that you get something out of this time, and if you haven't been inspired to innovate and work hard and make a mark by Dr. Mulder's presentation, you're really going to have to reach with us here. I work and live in Dallas as a development manager for Hillwood Communities. I oversee our amenities programs in most of our master plan communities. I will have been there for about 5 years. So I graduated from the Master of Science and Land Development in 2012. I have a beautiful South African wife and 2 children. I'll get to that South African thing here in a second. So the next 7 speakers are going to kind of, we're stacked in chronological order. We will, I think there's 2 things to note. First, actually my 2 observations. One is that we all were exposed to Dr. Mulder, CMI, and these principles, and I think we've kind of coordinated to speak on various topics, but we all had the same exposure. We can all kind of agree our time in Knysna, South Africa, and with CMI was an amazing one. The second you'll notice is our scope changed. So from my start as a land planner, landscape designer, to I think Jason's ending up doing a lot of pro forma financial work for them. The way that we work through the office was slowly evolved. Unlike the interns, quote unquote, following me, I did everything backwards. I started off in 2005 with Chris and worked for nearly 5 years with him. And then I came back. It was in a room with Jeffrey and Chris that Jeffrey Booth said, well, why don't you join the program? And so I worked for 5 years and then came back to clarify. So my time in South Africa, if I had to summarize my 5 years, it was I developed hobbies there, I busted my face there, mountain biking, I met my wife, we got married there, we had our son there. So to try to summarize things in 7 minutes was a little bit of a challenge. So my story starts actually June 12, 2004, and I wrote Dr. Michael Murphy. It was an email that I titled, "In Need of Advice or Suggestions." And Dr. Murphy wrote me back. 4 days later, he said, "You might contact Dr. Chris Mulder. He hired many of our students," and I still find this out, the woman who worked for him in 1980, you know. He hired many of our students. He is also an Aggie. So it was 4 months later, I was offered the position, and then 4 months later, visa, all that work permit stuff came through, and I joined. My first day was January 27, 2005. I joined Dr. Mulder on a contract for 2 years. Who knew? Who knew? So I'm just going to go through the list. I think the list was right here. Just the list of projects. There was Thiessen Island Dry Mill, Honglip, Curlin. I'm going to butcher these names. He always thought that was great. Kieloutboom, George Rex, Fleming Flay, Rudefontein, Pisang Filet, Mossel Sport, Banyan Tree, Beauplas, and of course worked a little bit on this Crossways Farm Village. So throughout all these projects, I witnessed Dr. Mulder, Chris interact with a variety of consultants, specialists, the design team, the client, socioeconomist. I mentioned the client. This is that multidisciplinary collaboration that he mentioned before, and I think that really was a defining aspect of my time there. I looked it up. What Urban Dictionary is the greatest resource for knowledge here. Urban Dictionary defines collaboration as an unnatural act practiced by non-consenting adults. As an example, worker A: we have no common interest, we don't like each other, and it irritates us to work together. But we were told by management to engage in collaboration. This is not what I witnessed in Chris's behavior. He's a affable facilitator, I would say. And it's funny, he engages in personal relationships, and then he pushes his team to create. He's got all these behaviors. And I was watching even as you were up here. He would go, he'd rub his forehead when he was really concentrating, or if he was disappointed, and he would lean back. He would nod. He nods on his knuckle. He takes his glasses off. But all these things, they all engage the team. They all engage the group of professionals around this table, and he pushes them. I was never in a meeting that he didn't have some kind of directive. We need to get this done. We need to make this happen. A phenomenal thing to be a part of. And it's interesting, too, to note all those projects. He pushes these guys in a tight-knit team. He pushes them. And of all the projects that I mentioned, there are maybe 2 or 3 that have made strides in their approvals or where they're at now. But I think, there's still hope. There's always that hope that it's gonna happen. And that collaboration is magic. At the heart of that collaboration, I think there are really 3 elements. One, you have to have a facilitator like Chris, somebody who sits at the head of the table. And 2, you've got to be able to have people that think outside the box. Whether it was a wildlife specialist, a landscape architect, some kind of stormwater engineer. Everybody would throw out ideas. And I think the 3rd, you've got to have that specialist or that consultant, that guy that comes from out of town, to take that idea and run with it. Take a small idea and build it. And I think even you mentioning those Gabions is a great. I remember meeting the guy who came and pitched this idea of a Gabion and thinking through all those factors and doing the engineering on it. But now it stands as a great piece of your success. And so when I look at what we do at Hillwood Communities as well, and what I do in my professional life, we, at the beginning of a master plan community, spend about 3 days in what we call an innovation workshop. And through that time, We engage stakeholders, specialists, builders, anybody who's involved with the project. And by the end of the project, you have a room full of believers. You have a name. You have usually rough financials. And that pushes us through entitlements. And even in my personal life, I will sit at a table with, I don't know, 15, 20 consultants or contractors. We've had design meetings, but rarely do I find myself in a meeting that I'm not thinking back to those days in the boat shed where Chris would have a sign on the outside of the door. It was called the Agree Room. And you went in knowing you're going to be led, it's going to be a part of the team, and this is for the project. So a lot of pieces and parts of what I've just said, but three things really. One, get a job. Use your resources. Use this place. This is an amazing place. When I think of all of you, again, thanks for your time. And you're probably looking at the future and real estate or development, but it rests on you. Don't use conventional methods. Think about all the places you could go. Think about all the things you could do. It is really a wide ocean of places you could go. And the second thing, and don't rely on that piece of paper. Like, you're going to get a degree, but you're going to be hired for who you are and what you can bring to the table. Second thing is, I never saw Chris walk into a room and sit at the head of the table and demand respect. He was who he was, and people respected and admired him for the work that he does and for the work that he's led his teams in. So he's gained his respect, and that's something to always, people will look at you and follow if you lead, but do that not from the front, but from the back. Push. He was always pushing. And the third thing, I don't know, many of you probably have these these Aggie rings, and if you look at that just for a second, if you think about that shield on the front, what that means, the tradition that the school upholds, the reputation that the school upholds, and then we are linked by those 5 attributes, emotional, spiritual growth, professional growth, integrity and character. That network is real. From that first email that I sent to Dr. Michael Murphy, to working with Don Austin in South Africa, to Chris Mulder, and then here at the university, Jeffrey Booth, you're not an Aggie, but we consider you an Aggie. Dr. Anderson, all these Aggies that you will touch throughout your life. It is a real thing. So I look forward to seeing what you guys do, and thanks again for your time. That's it. Oh, there you go.
Hello? Can you all hear me? My name is Ruben Esqueda, graduating class of 2011. I currently live in Dallas. I'm a affordable housing multifamily developer. I specialize in a product that started back in the 80s under the Reagan administration. Was basically a response to the development of what everybody calls projects, and decided to change the paradigm in that industry and take private developers to provide affordable housing. So I work in an industry that provides housing to those families that make as little as $10,000 a year, and provide them a clean, safe environment to go to stay at and have access to jobs and schools. And part of what gravitated me to that industry was from what I learned in my short time there at CMAI. So I'll go through my story a little bit and end with what I learned. I first met Dr. Mulder in 2010. Just one of my normal classes, the buzz was, oh, Dr. Mulder's coming to town. He's an alum. Oh, okay, another guest lecturer. Great. We've had several of those. But it was completely different, and by far the most memorable. I sit in a class, there's 15, 20 of us. He sits at the front. And he didn't have the benefit of slides at that time. I think he just arrived a couple hours prior, and starts telling stories. And when you hear from other developers, everyone kind of sticks their pin on one aspect of it. Oh, this deal made $20 million, or we did this or that. His stories were much more interesting. He tells a story of, well, I flew a helicopter and I stopped at this one site and I walked and I looked for animal dung. That's an interesting market study, because if this is where the animals choose to be, I know people will want to be there too. Like, wow, that's deep. Space planning. I told someone to stand there, and I just kept walking until he couldn't hear me, and then I marked this spot in the sand, and so this is where we're going to put this building. Like, that's urban planning. That's sweet. Love it. And it was very inspiring. It was very different. A lot of developers develop in these sort of boxes. Everything's a box. And this was different. And it was a great experience. Really, very energized just listening to him talk. Then following semester, I see a board put up at Langford, up at the top of the stairs. And every day I would walk by it, and I saw it, and I poked my head by it, and I read it, and it says South Africa, study abroad, Chris Mulder, and oh, this is interesting. Oh, but it's geared towards architects. They can go study architecture, which I'm not an architect. I was in the MSLD, what it was called the MSLD program at the time. And I thought that'd be a really interesting opportunity, but oh well, it's not meant for me. Move on. And sometimes life it leads you. Sometimes it knocks, and sometimes it kicks the door down. And I think that happened with me. One day an email was circulated, hey, we don't have enough architects. We're now open to anyone. Oh, well. All right. So now I had to go figure out, how do I make this happen? I got to talk to Professor Booth, and can we work out my curriculum to allow me to go? More importantly, I had to go talk to the financial aid department. And then my wife, I was recently married, freshly married, and had to say, hey, by the way, do you want to go live on another continent for 3 months? And that was an interesting conversation, and she was like, let's do it. So we worked it out. Here I was South African bound, and we jumped on an airplane, and I knew the program and the curriculum was architecture, but I said, I'm going to go, and I got to somehow work my way into this company and learn about what they do, because this is a very rare opportunity, and I'm meant to know more about this. So here I am on this 20-hour flight strategizing, okay, what if I do this and if I do this? And like I said, sometimes life just knocks the door down. And instead of me approaching them, I was called into the office and said, would you be interested in assisting in this Crossways Farm Village? Oh, yeah, awesome. I'm all for it. Let me at it. Again, the project was built outside in the rural part of South Africa, and the problem was, well, how do we provide utilities and services that a municipality would? In Texas, we have something very similar in the form of a MUD, municipal utility district, and I just recently learned about MUDs in Dr. Anderson's class, so I tried to take what I knew in that framework and said, okay, I think we can build something like this. And over the next 3 months was able to focus on putting together a report of what could be done and how, and it was a blast. It was my first experience with a real developer. It wasn't theoretical, it wasn't in a book, and the biggest takeaway was working with this very talented group of individuals and see how they process things. And when you're a student, you learn lessons, you learn topics, but the practicality of what you use those lessons, it's something that only comes from experience, so this was a big deal for me. So I presented my analysis we looked at in conjunction with a consultant and different groups from CMAI. We built a framework of, here's how trash will be handled, and here's how utilities can be provided, and here's the rates, and here's the financials. And it was a blast, and I think me and my wife speak of that time very fondly all the time. So my two takeaways that I took away from the program, at the time it wasn't really supposed to be an internship. I always refer to myself as the South African hipster. I did it before it was cool. And there was no program, it was just sort of thrown into it. And I took a lot from that, and I've applied it into my career. I mean, it shook me on a fundamental level, and it has its fingerprints throughout my career, from things as low as, I somehow got to convince Civil to put a roundabout in one of my projects because of the roundabouts I saw on Thiesen Island, all the way to the principles that I practice on a daily basis. So quickly, I'll just share my 2 lessons learned. I tried to narrow it down to one. I couldn't, and this is where I left off. I'm a numbers guy, so when I think of development, I think of a formula, and to me, development equals thought over time. And the more thought that goes into these developments, the better the development is. And you can see that when Dr. Mulder speaks of his developments, from things of light fixtures. It's a little thing, but it adds up. And those kind of thoughts over time makes huge projects, and not one person's thoughts. Development, what I've learned from my career, is that it's not one person. It's the collective efforts of many people's thoughts. Architects, civil, landscape planners, urban planners. This collective effort of thoughts over a period of time generates these products. And I learned that lesson, and when I build my teams in the development side, I always focus on building the correct team and making sure I have all the correct people, because those thoughts are going to add up, and either they'll create something beautiful or they'll create something disastrous. And then the second thing I learned is that true development is not brick and sticks. It's what occurs between the ears. And we have to have that constant thought, and always focus that as developers, we're truly stewards of our environment, and that there is a difference between developers. A good developer, in my opinion, creates spaces, and that's nice. But a great developer develops society through development. They recognize that it's an ecosystem, and they understand that this will leave a legacy and will affect the people around them. And as you can see from these presentations from the group at CMAI, they have that focus, and they create ecosystems.
So we've all been given, as you can see, the impossible task of summing up our experiences in 6 to 7 minutes. I think we could each fill the hour and then some. But my journey starts, I graduated in 2016 with dual degrees in planning and land development. My story starts the spring before that, when Chris mentioned the trip he came and spoke with our class, and then to the College of Architecture as a whole. Jeffrey, I think, introduced me to Chris, and we had a brief discussion, and he very casually offered up this extraordinary opportunity. It was so casual that I had to follow up a few weeks later and ask if he was serious. Basically said, yeah, get your way, pay your way there, and we'll make it happen. I didn't know it at the time, but that offer came just weeks after the fire that you saw took built upon their office, half the boat shed. And I mention that because that, I think, highlights Chris's graciousness as a person, and then his commitment to the program, that he'd be willing to open his doors and take in a student like myself and still give that opportunity even in when they have nothing to give. And I was maybe brave enough or ignorant enough to double down, and I asked if my wife could come as well, and he was all hands on deck for that as well. So it was just an incredible opportunity. While there, I worked on a couple projects extensively, Caballos, which was spoken about, and Queenstown, primarily on the feasibility end. Worked with realtors, with builders, with Chris, trying to nail down what this is actually going to look like and how it's going to perform. As much as I learned through doing that, I learned just as much through the really intimate personal conversations we were able to have with Chris, and somebody that I would be remiss not to mention, his wife Pat. Just extraordinary people, and willing to really take you under their wing and show you the South African experience, but also show you the CMAI experience. And there was just a huge, it was 7 weeks, it was a short time, but it was a huge period of growth, personally and professionally. I just brought a few images of of projects that are really hitting home with me now. I currently work in New Braunfels, Texas, on the Varamendi Master Plan community. It's 2,500 acres. There's, I would call it your typical master plan community. It has everything from single family to your town center piece. There's a lot of moving parts. Actually, Rob and I are working really closely on that right now. But a few things that I wanted to focus on were, on the left here you see a beautiful example of adaptive reuse, the sawmill being turned into an award-winning multifamily project. It's on Thiessen Island. It's beautiful. I know Eugene and Chris worked really diligently on that to deliver something that is just a well-defined, full of character place to live and place to want to be. On the right, you have something that's maybe at a starting point of that. It's of the whole 2,500 acres, it's the only real improvement on the property. It's a 60-year-old red barn. It may look like it's maybe destined to be torn down, but it's actually in the next sector that we're planning now, and I'm hopeful that there's a creative use for this, and whether that's a public center, whether that's some kind of community garden. The Hill Country is not a very bountiful place to grow crops, but 50 years of cow patties may help out and may prove fruitful. It's just an opportunity that it's just staring me in the face, and it has a lot to do with what we've done with Chris. This is a picture of the inside, just showing you it's got great character. It's calving season, so you got baby cows everywhere, which is kind of fun to go out and look at. But it has a ton of opportunity, and it's directly because of those experiences that we're considering how we can leverage this to add value. The other thing I wanted to mention specifically is, again, on the left you have Neisner, and on the right you have the Guadalupe River, which I'm sure many of you who visited New Braunfels have floated right by our property and probably never known it. It's both are extraordinarily beautiful places in the world. South Africa feels a little more exotic, but Texas Hill Country at the Guadalupe River is pristine, beautiful land. And again, this is something that, I think we've all envisioned a resort going in. I think you have to balance that commercial venture with the environmental stewardship, with sensitive placemaking. And again, this is something that's not maybe years, but decades into the future. But it's this long-term planning that you need and long-term visioning that you need to have a successful project, and not just four walls, but a place that people want to be, and a place with lasting value. The two major takeaways that I just wanted to tell is, I never thought this opportunity would happen to me. Some of you are probably in similar situations where you never thought travel abroad, let alone study and work abroad. But it's exactly as Quincy said, the connections that you have here, embrace them, take advantage of them, show up to things. You have no idea what opportunities can blossom out of that. The second thing I just wanted to leave y'all with is, it's one thing to have these beautiful concepts and plans and ideas for things. It's really difficult to deliver those and to see it to completion. So I urge you, when you're doing these concepts, when you're out in the real life, doing these landscape plans, doing these architectural plans, visualize the end result and think about the processes that are necessary to get there, because there's going to be bumps in the road and there's things that you'll never expect, but the more you think about it, the more successful you'll be. So that's all I had. I just pass it over to Chad to keep things going.
Howdy. It's the first time saying that as a grad, so it's been pretty busy since graduation. I graduated from the MLPD program in 2016, December, and now up in Chicago, and I gotta say, it's much better weathered down here, much warmer. So a little bit about my story. I was similar to these guys. I didn't really plan on going over to South Africa. It kind of just came about. Dr. Mulder came and spoke to a few, I heard him speak in a few classes of Professor Booth's, and it was, as you can see, it was great to hear him speak about some of his projects and his developments, and it kind of inspired, me as a student, and then that kind of led to reaching out with Professor Booth and Dr. Mulder, and Rob and I ended up going over together and spending from about June to, or the end of June all the way till almost close to September in South Africa. So not only was that a great professional experience and learning experience with CMAI, but it was also the personal experience and just the life experience. I got lucky and I got married in Mexico in June 11th of 2016, and then the week after I flew over to South Africa, and my wife came down later. But it's kind of funny how we all have these interesting, partner or wife stories that go along with our journey. So I like to kind of start off by saying just kind of the two major takeaways I had from going over to CMAI. My background was in landscape architecture undergrad, so I had a good understanding of kind of the design concept and the environmental aspect of things that they teach here at Texas A&M. So as soon as I went over there, it was great to see a firm that kind of had this all-inclusive landscape architect, engineers, architects, development, kind of this whole aspect incorporated together. So learning how to take those landscape architecture skills that I had and apply them to kind of real estate development or land and property development was very cool to see, and kind of something that I took away, how to adapt these skills that I've learned in undergrad and come back and apply them to kind of land and property development and just real estate development in general. The second takeaway would be just the relationships part of CMAI and kind of Dr. Mulder in general. As you can tell, he's very involved with the community, and that's kind of a little, you don't see that as often, I think, sometimes in development. They kind of are doing these projects maybe that they think will be successful, and maybe the community is against it and whatnot. But I think that's something that it's very valuable that I took away from there, that how involved with the community he is, and how understanding of what it is that they want and how that impacts the success of the project. The second kind of aspect I'd like to talk about is how going over to CMAI kind of impacted my career coming back to the United States. So I came back and graduated the following semester, and I knew that I wanted to do something similar as to CMAI, but that's very difficult to find a firm that is so encompassing of what they do and details some of these awesome projects, as you saw Leon and everybody present. So in search for a career, I didn't plan on coming back and going to Chicago necessarily, but my wife's job and whatnot took us up there, and I started the search for jobs, and now I work for Project Management Advisors. We get to work on all different sorts of projects, a little different. It's obviously a much more urban environment, so we're dealing with mixed use and more high-rises and whatnot, but at the same time, I think a lot of the principles that CMAI does, we kind of get to see, from a different view now, and I think that going over to CMAI was a very valuable experience. And coming back, when I started looking for companies to work for, I wanted that collaboration aspect. I wanted a firm that valued their employees as well as the communities and the developments that they were a part of, and I got lucky to find that as well. Another impact on my career is just, as you can see, like the way that CMAI kind of analyzes and looks at land and developments in general. That kind of gave me a different aspect on how to do that, and from due diligence that we learn in school, from the financial feasibility studies. I think that going over there and seeing how Dr. Mulder kind of approaches these projects was another takeaway that I hope to use someday on future developments of my own. And then that kind of goes into the future a little bit. I think I have the design background in landscape architecture. I'm working a little bit as a project manager on all different sorts of developments, and then having the MLPD program, learning the finance and more of the land development side, to someday hopefully maybe partner up with one of these guys and do some work of our own. But yeah, it was overall a great experience in South Africa, and just getting to see Dr. Mulder and the team again has been a great experience, and enjoyed getting to hear everything. It kind of brought back a lot of memories, but it was a life experience that I'll never forget, and I think Rob I'll pass it on to him, and he can kind of go along with some of the, yeah. I think there's a few slides in there.
That's okay. Let's see here. How y'all doing? Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Max, you want to help me out?
Yeah, I'll
Sir.
be your controller.
So I chose a little more informal picture since I knew I was going to be up here in the monkey suit today. And I thought about putting Chad's Scuba Steve picture up here as well, but I didn't think he'd appreciate that. So my name's Robert Fox. I graduated the same year as Chad, 2016, from the MLPD program. You know, my background, I grew up on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and I actually spent about 9.5 years in uniform. Went to the Naval Academy for my undergrad and was a Marine Corps platoon commander for a while. And so I've got to say right off the bat, you know, it's an incredible privilege to be able to come up here and share thoughts on CMAI as a whole, on all the different team members that Chad and I and all the other guys that are up here, you know, all the other guys we got to meet. And specifically Dr. Mulder, I mean, I can't say enough. The cup's kind of overflowing right now, if you can't tell. Just bringing back memories like Chad said. You know, Dr. Mulder is really good. Chris is really good about, you know, giving task, purpose, and end state. And those are three things that, as a Marine Corps leader, you're always taught. It's task, purpose, and end state. When you're dealing with other people, you've got to lay out exactly what the work that's expected of you is. That's the task. You've got to understand why, and you've got to make sure that your team understands why, so that they can then, in the absence of leadership or direct intervention, they can go out and carry out that task. And then you got to show them an end state. The end state, you know, when it comes to land development architecture, is what y'all have been seeing all morning and what the team members from CMAI have been presenting up here. I mean, look at some of these projects, Teeson Islands and Crossways and communities like that. I mean, that's the end state, and that's what we're all shooting for, you know. And I think we're, you know, in my, you know, little experience in land development so far, I'm currently working in San Antonio for David Weekley Homes. I'm the land guy, land manager and development manager. Where Chris differs, I think, is that he dwells on the purpose, and he never loses sight of the purpose of what he's doing. You know, Chris is a farmer by trade. That's how he started out, and he's got a lot of stories that hopefully you'll all get to hear from him at some point, or hear from some of the people that have been touched by him. And you know, the thing about farmers is that they know the land, right? Farmers know their land and their piece of land better than anybody else in the world. They know where the prevailing wind's coming from. They know where the microclimates are, where the shade hits, where the sun hits. They understand how acidic or how alkaline the soil is, and they get to know that because they spend time getting to know it, and learning it, and they begin to love it. And that's something that I really have taken away from Chris, is that you really have to embrace every project that you go after, and understand that there's a purpose behind every one of those projects, and don't lose sight of that as you're going through your economic feasibility, your due diligence investigations, things of that nature. And this next slide, thank you, sir. So a couple of things that I want to dwell on in light of that, I guess. You know, I took a more, you know, I think after listening to Chris and after listening to the rest of the team, it's pretty clear what kind of a leader he is. You can see that he's enthusiastic, he's passionate, he can put a deal together better than anybody, bring people together. But I wanted to talk about some of the technical aspects too, while my short time is running out here. What you're seeing in front of you is a site plan for Crossways Farm Village, the project that y'all have seen, which is a new rural town east of Neisner. And one of the things that struck me the first time I saw this image was how much white space is on the screen. I mean, you think about taking down a parcel that's the size of a small city, and most developers immediately are thinking, oh man, what's the density, right? How am I going to get my money back out of this enormous acquisition? And one thing that you all probably weren't able to see, it's on one of Chris's slides from earlier, is that in the top right corner, he had a whole bunch of maps of Crossways Farm Village that looked at the slopes, that looked at the soils as far as how prime they were for agricultural use, that looked at the hydrology of the land. And his team had layered all those images on top of each other, and they figured out that these areas right here that you see, you know, there's urban development on, those are all the non-prime areas, basically. Chris likes to talk about go-go, slow-go, and no-go development as far as land use policy, and I think that's probably the best way to look at it. What you're seeing there is go-go, right? He's identified the places that are ripe for urban infrastructure and urban development. You know, here in the United States, we might think of those, you know, maybe brownfield sites or grayfield redevelopment, infill parcels within our cities. Those are all go-go sites. They're not necessarily primed for some kind of other use or prime natural areas. Slow go obviously might be something like our greenfield sites. You know, we've got a problem in the United States with urban sprawl, right? All of our various metropolises, to include, you know, Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, we're kind of converging slowly but surely, especially in the post-World War II era. And slow go, you know, would tell us, hey, we need to think about, instead of expanding outward, we need to, you know, take a page from the New Urbanist Handbook and maybe start looking at what we can reuse. A lot of CMAI's projects are adaptive reuse. They're taking what's there, taking inventory of it. And a lot of times what I found in San Antonio, working on infill projects with David Weekley Homes, is that you can get steals on some of those properties, and then you can turn around, flip them, maybe remediate them if they have copper chromium arsenate or whatever it was with Teeson Islands, and do something that's really spectacular. And then you've got no-go. In Crossways, a lot of the white space that you see there is no-go, and that's USDA prime land, right? That's best served for in an agricultural use or in a natural state or something similar. And you know, I just thought it's an interesting way to look at context-sensitive design. And I guess the last thing that I'd like to speak about, actually, here's a couple of images of Crossways in action too. The Castle Hill concept that y'all saw earlier, there it is built out in living color. And here's an image of a community in Elgin. It's also an agrarian community that I worked on before I joined Weekley Homes, where they've, you know, taken some of the same principles. It's not laid out as well necessarily as how CMAI might do it, but you got density where density belongs, and you've got open space where open space belongs. Last concept that I think is really peculiar to CMAI is that you know, this concept of new ruralism is important. You know, in the United States, for the first time in the last probably 40 years, in 2012, we started having a resurgence in young farmers. You know, Texas A&M is an agricultural college, and we've seen generation upon generation of farmers for the last few decades peter out and leave the land, right? But for the first time, we've got young farmers that are picking up the shovel and getting after it themselves. And so, you know, Chris and I have talked about, while I was in South Africa, the fact that organic agriculture really doesn't lend itself to a industrial scale. It's going to be these small farms that continue pushing that ball forward, I guess. And you've got to give those guys and girls a place to work and a place to live. And this concept of new ruralism does that. You put density where density belongs, and you maintain the best features of urbanism, but you integrate them perfectly into the natural world. And so, that being said, these are a few images from, you know, our trip from South Africa. Yeah, you see Chris in his natural element, enjoying himself in Teeson Islands. Chad and I got to go on a little boat ride with him, and then some of the members of the team, including Leon there with the mohawk, I think. So, incredible journey. Chris, I can't thank you enough for your time, and I'll turn it over to Jace.
All right, well, howdy. My name is Jace Binnell, and Jason and I are going to do this a little differently. We both went down there together, and everything we worked on was kind of as a team. Yep. And so my background, I'm currently a student, year 7 of 8 here, going for a dual master's between land and property development and architecture.
Likewise, I finish up doing the dual degree this May.
So I have a year and a half left. But here's some of the projects we had worked on. Primarily while we were there, they were all quite interesting. We applied all the skills and values that we have learned in the program directly. We went down for the more analytical aspect of things, but also with our architecture background, we started tying in the design portion.
So, howdy, I'm Jason. Like I said, I'm a dual master's with architecture and land development, and I finish up here in a couple months, so almost done.
And so this is quite interesting. This was Stompnius. This was our first project when we arrived. Chris had it in his mind that we were there to run the numbers, and it was an awesome experience getting thrown into all the mix and having to figure it out. It's a giant puzzle. This one's quite interesting because it goes directly with the basis of location, 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 and timing, timing, timing. Prime location, beachfront property. The market wasn't quite there, but Chris had an awesome vision for this property. We tried to make it work every which way. The project actually got tabled for a later date, but it just exemplifies the design aspects that CMAI is accustomed to.
Yeah, it was a very interesting project because for both of us doing the dual for architecture and land development, coming up with multiple schemes and running feasibilities on them. And it was really the first time that I got to see firsthand the impact that the architectural design and concept has on the financial feasibilities. And so we went through multiple iterations trying to get it all to work out. But as Professor Booth says, there wasn't quite that laser alignment between basically what the site could render and should render and what the market really had. So ultimately it had to get tabled for now.
And then here was another project that we worked on. It was Boplos. It was a subdivision, I believe about 2,000 urban, which urban refers to lots. It's quite interesting with this one. They had a couple days to get the design out the door and through the approval process, or else they would lose entitlement for the whole project. And so about half the office switched over to this. This was our first big design project with them. And towards the end of it, it got interesting because the units, we had to run a feasibility at the same time along with designing. The units weren't going to meet the target market as it was affordable housing. So what happened with the last couple hours to spare is we made small and large options. And so it was quite interesting.
Yeah, it was, we were kind of really thrown into it. Obviously it was crunch time, which obviously will happen in our professional careers. But as Jace alluded to, it was truly a lesson from Dr. Anderson about the whole vesting process. And basically it was, if we didn't get something in the ground immediately, the entitlement stuff and facilities agreement would have gone out the window. So it was a crunch to get something in the ground so that it could go through.
And so this was June 7th. We actually woke up. It was hard sleeping that night. We didn't know there were fires outside. The whole room smelled like a campfire. It was definitely not a normal morning. The coffee shop was closed inside the hotel, and we're like, what's wrong? And so we went across town. On every horizon, there's giant plumes of smoke. It was really a state of emergency because they were having a cold front. It's basically their version of a cold front. It's like a hurricane without rain, just gale force winds coming off the ocean. And so these fires were sparking up everywhere. Quite scary, but we didn't think it was close to the office, so we still went in for the day. And then news kept coming in, and this is actually taken right outside the front door of the office about noon when they decided to close up for the week. It really shows there's numerous examples of Dr. Mulder and his team's leadership of opening up their home. The island was kind of a place of refuge for the community to come, and we'll touch on that in a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, so like Jay said, when we woke up, our room was filled with smoke. I thought somebody was having a braai, which is their barbecue, first thing in the morning, so I was a little confused. And then later in the day, as you can kind of see that the large picture, the smoke literally covered the entire sky. So, I mean, we were basically in dusk or nighttime for a few days straight just with the smoke. But as the day kind of progressed and we kind of realized how severe the situation was, like Jay said, we worked for part of the day and then realized how bad it was. And so we closed down the office. And we went back to the hotel room and tried helping out in any way that we could. And Chris and his wife, Pat, they opened up the hotel to the surrounding areas for people to kind of get safe harbor as homes were burning and everything. And I thought it was kind of an interesting thing because that building had burnt not that long ago, and then it kind of went full circle to being a safety net for people who were, again, running from fire. And just kind of going to Chris's leadership was, obviously that's a very intense time. People are, nervous. They got evacuated. They're not sure if they're going to lose all their belongings or not. But Chris kept in good spirits the whole time. He actually went around and got the little bottles of liquor that they would put in the hotel rooms, and were handing them out to keep everybody's spirits high and everything. Walking around like Santa saying ho, ho, ho to everybody. But, in a time of emergency, he stayed calm and level-headed, and was trying to make sure that everybody else was okay before himself. So that was a good lesson to see, and it was a wonderful experience.
Another story of that was, it was the second day when the power actually went out at the lofts. The batteries in the generator exploded. It was a brand new generator. Trying to figure out what was going on, and Dr. Mulder was out there. He was pretty frustrated, but it was interesting because he has the connections throughout networking in town. He's always helped people throughout the years, and that someone would be willing to help him in a time of crisis, because everywhere was closed in town. Everyone was trying to save their homes. This fire, it was about, I think, 1,200 homes were at least damaged. I don't know the exact count or how the statistics break down, but it was massive. This was one of the homes up on the hill. Beautiful view. I mean, I would die to live there. It's awesome. Neisner is beautiful, but this was a tragedy for the community. And so here was an aerial taken, and it kind of shows the resilience of the community. A couple weeks later, after the fires were under control, it was interesting seeing the firefighters. They would parade down the street and do different dances, and they were there for a good solid 3 or 4 weeks. And then the community came together. Every year they have Oyster Fest, and it's a 2-week festival. It's where athletes come in, and there's marathons, triathlons, cycling races. If you name it, they host it. It was interesting seeing everyone come in support of Neisner. And this was another element that Dr. Mulder had stepped up for, was the relief efforts. They had an architecture forum. In a way, it was all the city planners, managers, anyone involved with the building process. And one day we came in the office, and there were probably 40 people in a boardroom meant for 10 to 15. And it was awesome because they were making decisions on how to go about the relief efforts and a fast track to recover from this. And that ties into, on the next slide, we did research on how to go about creating these enduring assets in a mass form, and one of them was container home research. In the end, it came out to a novelty idea, because you can't actually get a mortgage on a container, a shipping container, which is quite interesting. But that kind of trickled over into numerous projects where we would explore land. Dr. Mulder and his team would show up, and they would do reviews of the design. They wouldn't care about the number. They would want to see the design first and see what type of area is actually being created, how the feeling would be for the community. And it's been touched on numerous times, but it's everything he does is built for the community and by the community. And that was a touching aspect while we were there.
Yeah, so as Jace was saying, about 40 people packed in this little conference room, from builders, architects, people from the municipality, and just being right on the other side of the glass, hearing the conversation of, 1,200 homes are now affected. Many of them need to be rebuilt completely. How are you going to get that through the approval process and everything? So Chris and his team stepping up and hosting all this to really try to help out the community, to try to streamline everything. And as Jace was saying, we got into the shipping container designs because the idea was these people are going to need shelter now. And with the amount of homes that were damaged and the labor force, it wasn't going to be feasible to get everybody to get a home built right away. So looking into the shipping containers for a quick but permanent and still enjoyable live house kind of became one of our next focus while we were there. So again, with that whole staying calm in a time of disaster, Chris stayed level-headed and tried to focus the whole office to how can we help the community. And even we were kind of at the beginning of a conversation of Chris starting another company to try to help all the people with their insurance claims and so forth. As obviously the insurance adjusters and everything were going to get swamped with all the claims. So having a middleman try to help out was one of his endeavors to again try to help out the community. So just a couple takeaways for the students that are here. I'm still a student as well, but the things you'll learn in the MLPD program and throughout all your academic career really do have an impact. Like I had mentioned, stuff from Anderson's class, we saw that firsthand. Lessons from Professor Booth, they really do transition into the professional world. So really take advantage of your education that you get here. And obviously the Aggie connection is strong. None of us would be up here if it wasn't for the Aggie connection. So embrace it, honor it, and stay true to the Aggie values. So thank you guys.
Right on time.
Well, it's very interesting to hear these guys. I encourage those of you who are students, before you leave, come and stand on this stage and look back out the other way, because in very short order, you'll be sitting in these seats too, right, guys? I mean, it happens faster than you think. Chris, to you, before we move to our next session, our Q&A session, many people are very, very satisfied to look over their shoulder as they walk on the beach and see one or two footprints in the sand. I think what we've already heard and seen today is you've got literally thousands of footprints in the sand, and your legacy is not only deep but wide. And these testimonials really showed that. So thanks, guys, for a good job. Really appreciate it.
Sounds the call to come together.